Be dismissed. Our reading today is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 46. We'll start at verse 3. Listen to me, you descendants of Jacob, all the remnant of the people of Israel, you whom I have upheld since your birth and have carried since you were born. Even to your old age and gray hairs, I am he who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. With whom will you compare me or count me equal? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared? Some pour out gold from their bags and weigh out silver on their scales. They hire a goldsmith to make it into a god, and they bow down to it and worship it. They lift it on their shoulders and carry it. They set it up in its place, and there it stands. From that spot it cannot move. Even though someone cries out to it, it cannot answer. It cannot save them from their troubles. Remember this. Keep this in mind. Take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please.
Okay. Thanks, George. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here again. Who said that? Okay. Okay. I'll get right into it. We could say hello later. Okay. So, from a bird's eye religious view of life and history, we exist within a mysterious tension between human freedom on the one side and God's predetermined purposes on the other. So the question is, what ultimately drives events? Our choices or God's plan? From our earthly perspective, the way we see things, right, it seems that everything is shaped by our decisions and outcomes, right? And since we witness these things firsthand, it appears that natural causes are sufficient to explain everything without the need for supernatural explanations. Nevertheless, many questions remain concerning the relationship between our choices, God's will, and the events that occur. Take, for instance, the tragic shooting yesterday of Donald Trump. For many years, there's been an increasingly aggressive rhetoric on both sides of the aisle across the country. Anger, rage, and hatred have only grown. Recent events have suggested that Trump might win the upcoming election, causing anxiety among his opponents. Then there was a man, perhaps mentally unstable, who for reasons we might never fully understand, decided to act upon an impulse. And so yesterday at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, he decided to take Trump out in the open. Now, if we were to delve, this is just an example, fresh obviously, if we were to delve deeper and analyze all the political, historical, psychological, religious, social, and personal aspects of the case, along with the myriad choices and actions taken over the past years, we could likely construct a miles-long flowchart of causes and effects leading up to the assassination attempt, if we were able to do that. The point I'm making is that with the right tools, we could probably provide a perfectly natural explanation for what happened yesterday without any reference to God's intervention. Then again, what if Trump hadn't turned his head at that precise moment? He would most likely have been killed. And you can't get much closer than a bullet taking off part of your ear. A believer might see in this, or might see this as God's divine intervention. Thinking that God could somehow have caused Trump to move his head at that precise moment. I don't think anybody who believes in God would have difficulty thinking he could do that minor task. But there's still questions. Why wouldn't God have simply stopped the shooter earlier in the day, perhaps by causing him to break his arm? And what about the man who was killed and the others who were critically injured? Did God intervene on Trump's behalf but not on theirs? Or perhaps everything that happened yesterday and everything that ever happens was predetermined by God. It was in his plan that everything should happen exactly as it did. The shooter shooting, Trump turning his head, the one man dying, the others injured. It's a possibility, though to my mind it goes too far. It seems too contrived to truly reflect God's revealed way of acting in the world. Now, as you may or may not know, for the next 4 Sundays, I'm doing a series on the book of Esther here at RBC. I was given 2 or 3 possibilities, I think, to choose from, but this was the most intriguing one for me personally. And I've read the book, probably like most of you. I've read the book a number of times. I've always enjoyed it, but when I started studying it to prepare it to preach sermons, I quickly realized it might be the most challenging series I've ever tackled. And this is because it directly addresses the mysterious tension between human freedom on the one hand and God's predetermined purposes on the other. And what intrigued me most upon carefully reading the book is how the author of Esther intentionally blurs the line between human choices and actions and those of God. He intentionally blurs it. It's as if he doesn't want the reader to be able to say at the end of the narrative, that was of man and that was of God, with any perfect certainty. In fact, upon finishing the book, the reader's left with a strange sense that God orchestrated everything to achieve his good purposes, while simultaneously recognizing that all events were natural consequences of human choices and actions. So this feeling is only heightened by the author's unique approach to Esther, as Esther, as some of you probably know, is the only book in the biblical canon where God is never mentioned or even alluded to. So for the following series of studies, I'm going to try, humbly, to explain the book in terms of what I believe is its principal message, namely the relationship between us and God in the context or the framework of divine providence. So, what is divine providence? I'll just give a definition. I think it's fairly standard. Divine providence is God's continuous and purposeful involvement in the world, where he orchestrates events, guides individuals, and ensures that his divine plan unfolds according to his will and his purposes. Okay, is that clear? Yes. Okay, that's what divine providence. God continuously and purposefully being involved in the world through various means in order to make sure that his purposes are achieved. Some hold the view that God's providential control extends to every single event and outcome of history and life, including all human choices and actions. We don't have a choice, we don't make a decision, we don't take an action unless God has already predetermined it. And this is called determinism, because it claims that in order for God to be truly sovereign, which the Bible says he is, okay? In order for God to be truly sovereign, he must determine everything so as to guarantee that his purposes are always achieved. And Scripture, as I just said, clearly states that God is sovereign. We read it in Isaiah. And he's sovereign over all creation. And he's totally sovereign, able to influence outcomes, including the choices we make. Another, far lesser sovereign, Nebuchadnezzar, came to this realization in Daniel 4, 34 to 35. And of Daniel's God, he said this. Remember, after his hair grew out and his fingernails, he was out in the wild for 7 years, and God humbled him there. What does he say about this God? His dominion is an eternal dominion, Daniel 4:34. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. Look, Father, that your will be done in heaven as in earth, right? As in earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? That's who our God is. Nevertheless, Esther, the book, paints a picture of a God who is so far in the background that everything that happens on earth in that story appears to be the result of natural causes and events, of the choices people make and their consequent results. That's what the book presents to us. So I've introduced this series on Esther by highlighting this heavy theological theme, because despite the absence of explicit theological language in the book, it's just a story, really. It just tells a story. Doesn't go into theology or all that. Despite this, the book consistently addresses this theme throughout the narrative. It portrays a God who, as described elsewhere by Jeremiah 23:23, who is simultaneously both near and far. Remember when God says, am I a God that's only near? I'm also a God who's far away, transcendent, sovereign over all. I'm not only your buddy, not only your friend, I'm your sovereign God at the same time. He's a God who intervenes in history, in a history that's thoroughly shaped by human choices and actions, and for which people are accountable. He himself holds people accountable, while at the same time sovereignly doing whatever pleases him whenever it pleases him. Not in a capricious way, not in a lighthearted way, according to his righteousness, his love, his grace, and all that. But he does whatever he pleases. Esther, in fact, doesn't present a God who gets his way by determining every human action, but rather by responding to human choices that threaten his purposes and covenant promises. That's how Esther portrays him. Furthermore, he often does this without manifesting his presence in any tangible way. You can't say, oh, look, there's a miracle. Oh, look, the sky is darkening, or he's making it rain, or whatever. However, his hiddenness, and God is a hidden God, his hiddenness brings its own rewards, stirring up praise and gratitude when we finally do realize that God had been present all along, during our trial, leading us to joyfully proclaim, I thought he had abandoned me, but now I realize he had been there all along. Has that ever happened to you? Right? He is hidden, but then at the end of it all, you realize that he was there after all. So notwithstanding all that I've just said, over the centuries, people have criticized the book of Esther for what they see as its lack of strong theology. It doesn't speak about God, right? And the criticism was especially clear in the early church, where opinions about the book were mixed, and it took a long time before it was accepted as Christian canon. Okay, so I don't know if you know anything of the story of how the Bible came to be put together, but it was a long process. Some books were accepted right away. Others took a long time for the church to decide, yes, this was from God or not. So instead of talking about what's in the book, scholars often focus on what's missing. And as I've already said, Esther is notable for being the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention the covenant name of the Lord, Yahweh, or even the title God, Elohim. Nor does it make any references to divine miracles, prophecy, prayers, the other Old Testament topics like worship, the temple, or the law. And because of all this, some people see Esther as just a regular story about politics in ancient Persia with no clear connection to divine intervention. Oddly enough, though, I'd argue that it's precisely the absence of obvious divine interventions that makes this story so relatable. Why is that? In fact, most of us can identify more with Esther and Mordecai than with the dramatic miracles of Moses or David or Elijah, right? We can relate more to what happened to Mordecai and Esther. Why we believe the stories of God parting the Red Sea, stopping the sun, protecting Daniel's friends in the furnace, we likely haven't witnessed anything similar in our own lives. Maybe, it could be, but to those scales, probably not. And if we're honest, we don't often see blatant miracles. Instead, life often feels more like Esther's story, a series of ordinary events with its ups and downs, sometimes very up and sometimes very down, without clear signs of God performing extraordinary acts. We might ask him for it. In fact, sometimes he even remains hidden when we're earnestly seeking him. Lord, do something. Do a miracle. I need a miracle. Silence. And we think we're on our own. So in this series of studies, I want to focus on how the book of Esther teaches us that even when it seems that God is absent and human choices and actions dictate absolutely everything, he is actually in complete control, meeting every evil intention and every wicked deed of man with righteousness, compassion, grace, and love. Why? So as to protect his people and work out his eternal purposes for them. God is looking at the end of all things. It's not that he doesn't look at what's happening, but he views what's happening always in view of the final state to get us there. And this he does without oppressing our free will. So since we don't have time to read whole chapters at a time during the messages, I've decided to simply summarize the story, for the most part, focusing on those chapters we're discussing on that day, that week. That's chapters 1 and 2 for today. And after, or intermixed with these summaries that I'll give, I'll share insights and reflections drawn from the text, particularly those emphasizing the nature of God's providential intervention in our life. So, the story of Esther. Yeah, just tell me what time I have to finish, because I wasn't...
2 o'clock?
2 o'clock. 2:30? No, no. 12? 12:05. Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, 11.
Okay.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock. Okay. So the story of Esther is set in Susa, the city of Susa, modern Iran, in the court of the Persian king Xerxes I, also known by his Hebrew name in some of your translations as Ahasuerus. I'm going to use Xerxes because it's easier. And it's in the NIV. That's the version I'm using. So Xerxes ruled from 486 to 456 BC, about 500 years before the birth of Christ, okay? And he's remembered by ancient historians as being a particularly ruthless and powerful king. After Xerxes' grandfather, Cyrus, you remember his name from the Bible, after Cyrus defeated the Babylonians about 70 years previous, or whatever, he put policies in place allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. This is all in the Bible. But the vast majority of Jews, in fact, remained in Babylon or moved farther east to Susa. Only a portion really returned to Jerusalem. This is why the Jewish population is spread out until this day. It also explains why there were so many Jews in the city of Susa at the time of Esther. So let's read the first 4 verses of Esther. Esther 1, verses 1 to 4. This is what happened during the time, I'm reading from the NIV. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, were the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. That's the bigwigs, the elites, were invited. For a full 180 days, have anyone thrown a party for 180 days? That's how rich and powerful he was. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So the king's reason for throwing a 6-month feast may have been to consolidate his authority over the provinces, to assert dominance over the numerous princes and nobles, or simply intimidate them with his display of power and wealth. You know, that's what kings do, right? It probably also served as an opportunity to enlist their military support at least, for his planned invasion of Greece. In fact, Esther is set against the backdrop of the Persian-Greek War, started by Xerxes' father, Darius I, in 499 BC. Neither father nor son had much luck against the Greeks. And during Xerxes' reign, the Persians lost major battles, and finally the war. And that's when we switched into the Greek dominance of the ancient world. Greece was between Persia and Rome in terms of dominance. So a famous battle that Xerxes did win, and you may have seen the movie, though he won it infamously, occurred in 480 BC when 300 Spartan soldiers, led by King Leonidas I, nearly defended the narrow pass of Thermopylae against a vastly superior Persian army led by Xerxes. The film 300, I don't know. It's okay. Anyway. It jumped. So in chapters 1 and 2, we're introduced to King Xerxes and his mega barbecue. At a certain point, during the banquet, drunk, as he tended to get, he calls for his queen Vashti, to parade herself before his guests, to display her beauty. He was showing off. He was showing his wife off. When she declines to be used as an object in this way, Xerxes is enraged. So he consults a group of nobles and to address this delicate situation, because there were protocols and all that. So he consults this group of nobles, and their advice is that Xerxes issue a royal decree, chapter 1, verse 19, stating that Vashti is to never again appear before the king, and that her position as queen should be bestowed upon someone deemed more worthy than her. So Vashti's gone. Following her removal, the king's advisors also suggest that a search be conducted immediately for a new queen. Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by her older cousin Mordecai, is among the young women brought to the king's harem for consideration. Significantly, on Mordecai's order, chapter 2, verse 10, she hides her Jewish identity, but eventually wins the favor of the king and is chosen as the new queen. And then we read in chapter 1, the next verses. We'll start at verse 4, though we've already read it. Chapter 1, verses 4 to 8. For a full 180 days, he, Xerxes, displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave another banquet, the after-keg party, lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden in the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. So the retreads were also invited to this one. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So then, why does the story begin by describing these massive parties that Xerxes threw? Probably because the author wants to establish from the start the full extent of the king's unlimited wealth, splendor, and power. Okay, he wants to establish that from the beginning. There's absolutely nobody in the kingdom, or probably on the earth, who at that historical point can say no to this sovereign ruler. He can do whatever he desires whenever he wants, for whatever reason tickles his fancy. He's like a god in the empire. His word is final. Therefore, when later on in the story he's cajoled by an advisor, Haman, to issue an edict to annihilate all the Jews in the empire, that's chapter 3, we readers fully believe, as it's written in 8:8, that no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. His word was final. So the problem the Jews faced later on was formidable. There is, however, a king in heaven who can do Xerxes one better, well, more. For way before the thought to destroy the Jews was even presented to Xerxes, the Lord, who knows the word completely even before it's on the tongue, already knew about it. Therefore, he guided people and orchestrated events so that when the time did come, a young, orphaned, non-entity Jewish girl would already be queen and have the opportunity to plead on behalf of her people before the king. Esther, then, at least in part, is a story about two sovereigns. One sits on the throne of the vast Persian Empire, full of pomp and glory, making his great power known to everyone with the parties he throws. The other is hidden from us on the throne of heaven. His name isn't even mentioned in the story. Xerxes speaks and a thing is done. And of course, the Lord did that at creation, and he could do that whenever he wants. But in the story of Esther, his approach is shown to be different from Xerxes, the Lord's approach. In Esther, we observe God working behind the scenes, responding to people's free choices and their consequences, rather than determining history by imposing his will like a dictator. This brings us to an important consideration when thinking about God's providence and sovereignty. The scriptures clearly state, Psalm 115:33, one of my favorite verses, our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him. That is so comforting. The question is, however, what exactly pleases him when it comes to exercising his sovereignty in the world? What pleases him? How does it please him to act? Does it please him to act like Xerxes, bending all and everyone to his will through brute power and force? Well, not in Esther. In Esther, the Lord appears pleased to respond rather than to dictate. And this approach actually helps us identify with him on a personal level. And personal relationship is precisely the point of God's covenants with us. As Jeremiah points out, God wants to be our God, and he wants us to be his people, his children, his people. In other words, he desires that we belong to each other in love, which, if it's to be genuine, must be free and personal. And this is why he sovereignly chooses not to use his sovereignty to control, coerce, and determine every aspect of life. His approach, rather, is to allow people to be people, even in their sinfulness. Have you ever noticed God allows you to sin? Right? In their sinfulness, in their bad as well as good choices, in their wisdom and their foolishness. Because the Lord has chosen to allow us the freedom to do good or evil, he has voluntarily put himself in a position in which he must intervene on behalf of his covenant people to make sure that those who love him do not finally fall victim to the plots and plans of wicked men. He has put himself in that position. That was his sovereign will, to act in that way, to let men choose good or evil, and then to intervene when necessary. His sovereign decision was to have this kind of relationship with the fallen world, to be a hard-working God, doing whatever is necessary, whenever necessary, to ensure that his purposes are achieved and his promises are kept. And doesn't Jesus say in John 5:17, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. In Esther, the point is made that although it appears that God is hidden in times of trouble, he's actually very near and hard at work. However, his nearness and his hard work shouldn't be mistaken for micromanagement. We have to be careful here. He does not dictate every choice we make or action we take. Nor does he intervene, I would say, in every aspect of life. Instead, he chooses his moments carefully. He has this luxury, because he's always observing, always watching, and therefore is always ready to intervene at a moment's notice on behalf of his people. He doesn't need to control everything that goes on, because everything doesn't threaten his purposes. When I drop a pencil, I don't think his eternal purposes are threatened, and he has to intervene and somehow keep the pencil in animation, suspended, so I can get it before it hits the ground and causes a butterfly effect and and all his plans are ruined. He doesn't have to intervene. There are some things that just happen. They're probably causes, natural causes and stuff, but they happen. Okay? But we can be sure that if something happens that threatens his plans and his purposes for us, he'll intervene to thwart it. He's like a potter. I love this. I love thinking of him like this. Isaiah says it. He's like a potter. His hands are always close to the spinning clay. No? You get the potter's wheel, right? The clay is spinning. That's life, right? His hands are always close, making sure it doesn't bend, thin out too much, clump, or break. But it does spin on its own gravity. He lets it do that. So the fact that God usually remains hidden behind the scenes is, in my opinion, a very good thing. Though at the time, we might be saying, God, where are you? But in the end, it's good that he chooses at times to remain hidden. And the reason I think this is that there is also great evil hidden in the dark places, so rampant that if God were to show all his activity openly, we would be completely overwhelmed by all the evil that he actually has to combat. One of the great values of Esther, then, is that it helps us understand that the Lord is never absent, but simply veils much of his sovereign activity from us, such that we can't always distinguish between what he causes and what the natural sequence of events causes. That's kind of that's that tension. Therefore, when we're tempted to believe that the Lord has abandoned us because he's indistinguishable from the normal ebb and flow of life, let's remember that he instead is busy working behind the scenes. As the psalmist writes, Psalm 121, verses 3 to 4, he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. We have a hard-working God. He says it. I wouldn't think of it in those terms, but that's his word. So, in the coming weeks, I want to explore these truths directly from the story itself. And this involves interpreting the events. We'll go through the events of the story, and then interpreting them as object lessons, illustrating how the Lord is actively present in the lives of his people, even though he's hidden, often hidden from sight. And until then, and I'll leave you with this, until then, let's actively recall. That recalling is an action, right? Let's actively recall how often God has seemed hidden during the difficult situations in our lives, only to later on reveal that he had been present all along. Let's call up those thoughts, those memories, right? And when we think of it like this, doesn't it make our past fears and anxieties look foolish? I think we were kind of talking about this the other day, right? When, after we realized that God had been there all along and he somehow brought it all to a close, we look back at how fearful and anxious we were and we say, when am I ever going to learn? Yeah. And if in hindsight, our past anxieties were all foolish, shouldn't we assume that one day our present fears and anxieties will also show themselves to be quite silly? If so, why do we expend so much energy and time worrying today when we could be remembering the Lord's faithfulness in those many yesterdays? And as we jog down memory lane of how often the Lord has come through for us, even when it seemed like he was nowhere to be found, let the Lord's past faithfulness be like wind beneath the wings. You know, that's a song, right? Lifting us up in the hope that even today, the great sovereign of the universe is working hard in undetectable ways to achieve his goals and purposes, his good purposes and his good goals and his good promises. And even if in the past things haven't always turned out, because this sometimes throws us for a loop. Sometimes it seems like God doesn't come through and we're still living years later the consequences of this or that. Even if this is the case and things haven't turned out as we desired and our lives have been turned upside down, we can still be certain that all things are working for our good because we love him. And as our faith matures, let's increasingly lean on the Lord. Lean on him. He's got broad shoulders, particularly during crises, while continuing to walk in the knowledge and the wisdom that we've accumulated through our many experiences. And finally, in times of overwhelming circumstances and complexity, has anyone ever been there? Work, relationships, finances, whatever. Let's simplify our lives by remembering our only real responsibility, at least according to Psalm 37:3. You know what your and my only responsibility is in whatever situation? Trust in the Lord and do good. And even if God's presence is hidden during these times, such that it seems he's nowhere to be found, we don't have to worry. Rather, as the psalm says, trust in the Lord and do good, and he will surely make you dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. If not immediately, certainly one day. That's our God, in total control of his purposes. He will achieve what he has set out to achieve. Lord God, we come before you recognizing your great sovereignty, but also your great desire to have a real relationship with us, to give us freedom that we might love you voluntarily. You are both very near and very far at the same time. Who can truly grasp your greatness? Lord, I want to pray particularly for anyone who is in a time of crisis right now, in difficulty, in trouble, and you might seem far away, absent even. Lord, help them remember that you are in fact working hard behind the scenes to achieve your good purposes. And in the end, even if all else should fail, go badly, in the end, the very end, there will be no more tears, no more suffering, no more fears, no more anxieties, no more wars. You will have achieved everything you've promised to achieve. So glory be to your name. Encourage our hearts with the truth of who you are as our Creator and our God. Amen.